Hi to everyone on Zoom. I'm looking at you. That's why my face is turned back. Okay. Hi, morning. Yeah, sure. Hi, morning. How are you? No worries. Hi, everyone. Okay. Great to see everyone here and great to see whoever's on Zoom. Everyone's on Zoom. I'm going to allow at the end, for those of you on Zoom, I'm going to open up your microphones at the end so you can also ask questions. Do you need a sheet? Here. Okay. Yeah. I just want. I don't have that many left. That's all I've got. Okay. It's the same sheets as last week.
This is the same as last week?
It's the same as last week. It's the same sheets as last week. Just pass that back. Anyone else? I've got two more. Going. Okay. So first and foremost, welcome everyone. Great to have you all here, those of you here and those of you on Zoom. Very excited to be back again. So we're going to finish this week the introductory classes, and then we're going to jump next week already straight on to Yosef. We spoke last time, so I'm just going to review what we did last time for those of you that were here or weren't here, even those that were here. We spoke about the idea of majesty and humility. Okay, we spoke about the notion of the mystery of the text, what we're trying to uncover, what we're trying to read in between the various silences that happen in the text. We spoke about the notion of how we approach the Torah, how we approach Torah learning. We spoke about the idea of the wilderness. Why the Torah is given in the wilderness, what the wilderness speaks of to us, okay? The notion of firstly of being rather than having, of our making ourselves into a wilderness and being able to kind of allow the Torah to infuse us at a point whereby we are empty to the extent that we're able to see in the text things that maybe we never saw before. And we left last week, we spoke about this idea of at the beginning of the class, I gave you kind of a background to where I see modernity, post-modernity. Today, polarization. Today is the 26th anniversary of Yitzhak Rabin's murder. And I think it's matim very much to what we're talking about in the class, which is this notion of, and we left last week with David Hartman, A Heart of Many Rooms, that when, this morning on the radio, I was listening to Galatz on my way in, and they interviewed the grandson of Yitzhak Rabin, and immediately after they interviewed Smotrich. And it was, to be honest, on both accounts, I actually, in the end, I turned the radio off because my heart was racing and I was getting so frustrated, and I just thought, this is not good for your health, so I turned it off. And I thought to myself, it's so sad that 26 years later we're still in this situation whereby even the language that both of them, right, the way that they were talking, the language that they were using, and both of them were claiming to be, living up to democratic values, and it was very, very difficult for me to listen just in terms of the polemic that was coming out on both sides. And I thought, to what degree I was like honing back to what we were talking about last week in terms of polarization, in terms of the way the world's gone and the way that or how we become. What does it really mean to be humble? What does it really mean to allow for dialogue to happen without it being dialogue that's going to lead to very kind of monopolization of the truth? And how does one achieve that? I was really thinking as I was listening on the radio, how does one truly achieve such a condition? And I think it's a lesson for us all in Israel today. I don't have the answers. I genuinely don't have the answers. And I think today we've all become, for so many reasons, so entrenched in what we believe, in the ideology that we adhere to. And there's nothing wrong with ideology. I believe ideology is important to us as human beings, right? However, and again, this goes back to what we spoke about last week. To what degree do I allow myself to elevate myself above somebody else, and to what degree do I humble myself in front of somebody else? And I think there has to be an oscillation between the two. And this is what we were talking about when the Torah is given to us in the Midbar. There is definitely this notion of looking around at the Midbar and just this awe. And I think I didn't approach this, I didn't touch on this topic this time, but at the beginning of last year's course, we spoke very much, when we introduced the course, we spoke about the idea of Yirat Elokim. And I bought for you a book by Howard Wetstein called, what's it called? I can't remember the name of the book, it's gone out my head. But he speaks about the notion of Yirat Elokim and what Yirat Elokim means. And he doesn't talk about it in terms of the fear, right? That fear that we often think about Yirat Elokim as being fearful. He speaks about it in terms of nurturing an awe-filled character. What does that mean, to nurture an awe-filled character? He says it's an ongoing process, not something that happens from 1 minute to the next. And to me, that's what I feel we're lacking today. I kind of feel like if we could infuse, right? And I'm talking to myself. I'm not saying in any way, I'm also as much guilty as the next person, but if we could all infuse, maybe into ourselves and work on ourselves primarily, to this notion of this awe, that there's something bigger than me. There's something larger than me. There's, very often we talk about wearing a kippah or wearing a head covering. And the idea is, to me, more than anything, when I wear my mitzpachat, is less about the notion of erva and more about the notion of just that recognition that there's something above me, right? And that there is something larger than me and something bigger than me. And everyone finds that in different ways. Some people need it as an external representation. Some people are able to do it through other derech, through other ways, so other drachim. But I think that there really is this need, really such a great need today for us to be infused with this Yirat Elokim. And when we approach a text, when we approach the Torah, I think to approach it with Yirat Elokim is the baseline, right? It's really that baseline. And in order to do that, it is a sense, we open ourselves up to a sense of vulnerability. And this is where we left off last week. When we speak about vulnerability, when we speak about the Midbar, essentially what we're saying is we're vulnerable, because when you're in the desert, you can't save yourself. There's no water, there's nothing that, we're totally dependent on God or on the resources that we've brought into the Midbar, into the desert. We're basically vulnerable. And I left off last week speaking about Brene Brown. I said we were going to read her. Brene Brown, who's become a very popular social psychologist. But I love her, and I love the way she speaks. If you've never heard her before, go onto YouTube and find her TED Talks. Her TED Talks are brilliant. If you have heard her before, then her interviews on podcasts on Spotify are excellent. She's got an amazing interview with David Kessler. She's got lots of other interviews, excellent interviews. And her books, The Gifts of Imperfection, it sits by my bedside table, and I try to dip into it every couple of nights, even just to read a bit while I'm falling asleep. They're just very cathartic. And one of the things she speaks about, her research project, was vulnerability. Okay, she speaks about the notion of vulnerability and what does it mean. And I'm going to come back to Ariel Berger in a minute, but I want to read Brene Brown first. That's source number 11. You are only free when you realize you belong no place. You belong every place. No place at all. Has everyone got it? Yeah. Okay. Source number 11. Yeah. I've got, yes, I have, yes. Yeah, I don't know if I've got any more. Hold on a second. Those two. It's the same as last week for those that still have it. And by the way, those of you on my WhatsApp group, I think I sent it to you because it's actually on Safari now. So you can actually, if you forget your sheet, you can just click in on your phone, which is very cool. Those of you that are not on my WhatsApp group and want to be on the WhatsApp group, send me your number and I'll add you. I'm the only one. I'm the only one that can post on it. So there's no discussions. It's literally just messages and things related to the class that I'll update onto there. Those of you that know people that are on it and want to come off it, just tell them to exit. That's also fine. Because there's like, I think 120 people on it or whatever. So I'm sure there's some people there that don't want to be on it anymore. But I'm not going to make a whole new group because I think that the majority of people were here last year. So I'm just going to add those that want to come on it. I will put this, I'll put this on it, the source sheet, although we're finished today, this source sheet, but the one for next time will also be on it. So those of you that come to the class will get a hard copy, but if you forget your hard copy the following week, you'll be able to click onto it and see it. Okay. So Brene Brown says as follows: you are only free when you realize you belong no place. You belong every place, no place at all. The price is high, the reward is great. True belonging is the spiritual practice of believing in and belonging to yourself so deeply that you can share your most authentic self with the world and find sacredness in both being a part of something and standing alone in the wilderness. True belonging doesn't require you to change who you are. It requires you to be who you are. Okay, so I don't agree with everything Brene Brown says. I do think that part of growth is to change. However, one of the things that she's saying here, and I think this is the deep message that she brings across, is the idea, I'm really sorry, I don't have any more source sheets. Take a thing. Maybe you could share with someone, whoever's got a source sheet that can share would be amazing. Okay, you'll listen. Fine, okay. Or if someone, I could, okay, for the minute just share with someone and I'll get you for the end of the class. One thing that Brene Brown says, and one of her main messages, is the idea that vulnerability leads to connection. That we can't have true connection or true relationship with somebody else unless we open ourselves up to being vulnerable with them. And by the way, again, I said this last week, but if you think about it in terms of your own relationships, you'll see it really is true. The people that you feel the closest to are the people that have seen you at your most vulnerable times. The people that where your barriers have been broken down. And to me, and here I'm taking it to, I'm doing something totally crazy, but I'm taking it to our relationship with the text. When we come to the Torah, it's not just a text that we're coming to dissect. We're coming to the Torah and we're coming to the text and we're saying, open yourself up to me and I'll open myself up to you. And to me, that is the way that Torah is Torah Chayim. Torah Chayim can only work, a living, breathing Torah can only work if we allow it to speak to us at our most vulnerable level. People ask me today, we had, thank God, a friend's bat mitzvah over Shabbat, with friends, away with friends, and a lot of people I was speaking to kept coming up to me. I don't know why they think I'm the point of call, because I'm totally not being massively successful myself either, but they kept coming up to me and saying, what do we do about our kids? What do we do about keeping them on the derech? What do we... Don't ask me. If I had the secret, I'd be able to tell you. But I think one of the things that we've lost, and to me this is really, it's very true, and again I'm not successful at it myself because my kids are not interested at the moment in listening to what Emma has to say about Torah, but one of the things that I'm hoping that somehow it will seep in over the years. At one point they'll turn around and say, oh, Emma, it's amazing what you taught us all those years and you sat at the Shabbat table and tried to impart to us. I'm just praying. I don't know if it's going to work. But one of the things that to me it really is key is to make it relevant. If it doesn't speak to them and that is what I think so many people today are struggling with, because we don't understand the generation. I don't understand this social media. I understand it, but I don't relate to it in the same way that they do. What today can pull them in to speak to them at their level? And that's where in my mind, that's where we're feeling. That's where we're failing. I don't know what the answer is. But the Torah isn't speaking to them as Torah Chayim anymore. And so to me, it's really about making it speak to me and learning at that level of vulnerability. Ariel Berger, who wrote a book on, did I read this last week, Source 10? Yes, I did, brilliant. Okay, so I'm not going to read it again. He speaks about this idea of going out to battle and taking off your armor. And to me, that really is like David, that idea of taking off your armor is exactly what Eli Wiesel used when he said he's learning Torah. So again, what have we learned here? We've talked about majesty and humility. We've talked about the idea of vulnerability. We've talked about the midbar. We've talked about opening ourselves up to the Torah. And this leads naturally, exactly what Brene Brown speaks about, that vulnerability leads to relationship. And relationship, chevruta, is the total key to Torah learning. Now again, every year I have a struggle specifically with my Renana class, which is one of my bigger classes, that this is not chevruta, clearly, okay? This is a frontal lecture, and however much I would love for it to be chevruta, and by the way, here's a promo for Thursday morning classes that I'm doing. That is really truly chavruta. We have real dialogue. There's only about 20 people. There's probably only 1 or 2 places left for anyone who's interested. And there we're really engaging in philosophical texts and we're having real chavruta time. This is more of a frontal lecture, and it's very difficult for me sometimes, especially when we did Zoom, that I feel like I want to take more than I give, and it's not so simple. But having said that, the true Torah learning, right? I'm not saying this isn't true Torah learning, but real, authentic, right? Torah learning in the classic form is through Chavruta. And I want you to look at the Pri Haaretz, the Rav Menachem Mendel Levitchnik. He says as follows: the Torah only stands firm in one who makes himself like a mitzvah hefker before those who are poor of mind and rich of mind. And he doesn't think of himself as better than his friend. And again, this is really, really important. And it goes back to what we were speaking about. On the contrary, he should be completely nullified before his friend. And it is through this that they become united and bound up with one another. Now, again, this is so beautiful, right? This idea of learning as a means of connection, right? That when I learn with somebody, I connect with them. If you remember, we looked right at the beginning at the idea of Moshe coming to tell Aaron about his death. And we said that at that moment, how does he tell him about the most vulnerable, about the most, that moment of mortality when it hits you, that's you at your most vulnerable. And in what sense, in what way does he tell him about that? Through Torah learning, right? There's something about Chevruta that engages one and creates a relationship that in a sense makes you vulnerable but also protects you, right? Because when you expose your vulnerability to somebody else, when you really want to connect with somebody else, that's also the moment whereby they protect you. If they're a good friend, if you're in a good relationship, right? Yeah.
It doesn't have to be if you're in a good relationship with them. If you give them that, if you open up to be vulnerable to the other, it doesn't have to be your best friend.
100% doesn't have to be your best friend, but you don't want it to be someone that, God forbid, would take advantage of your vulnerability. That's what I'm saying. You don't want someone because the whole point when you become vulnerable or expose yourself, you take a risk. You're always taking a risk, right? Faith is, Avraham Yeshua Heschel always says, right? Faith is a risk. You're leaping into the unknown. You're taking a risk when you create a relationship with a divine being that you are not 100% sure about. That's a risk, right? You're making yourself vulnerable to an extent. In some ways, it's easier just not to believe in something transcendent. And again, with anything. So I think it's not always true, but you're right. It doesn't have to be your best friend. It can be a stranger. It can be somebody else, but somebody who will allow for that vulnerability or hold space for that vulnerability is super important. Okay, so the Orach Chaim says as follows, and this is also to do with the idea of Chavruta. V'inyan gimel hu, and the third thing is b'chinat ye'ud chachamim b'hitchabrut b'lev shalem v'tamim lo shiyu bad b'bad she'alehem amar hakatuv. The third thing is coming to teach us the idea of coming together with a whole friendship that you shouldn't be separate, you shouldn't be alone, you shouldn't be on your own, separate from each other. Okay, and it brings a quote from Yirmiyahu, okay, of the idea of a sword on those who are studying alone, right? But ele yitvadu yachad v'yichdadu ze lazeh v'yasbiru panim ze lazeh. On the contrary, what we need is for people to come together to be mamash next to each other, right? And look at each other face to face. And I think that's super important to explain to each other. And it brings that pasuk from Har Sinai when they got the Torah. They are able to get the Torah because they came together. The individuals came together as one. And there's something here to me that the Orach Chaim is telling us that when we learn Torah together, there's a unity that is created whereby you still you still retain your individuality, but there's an achdut. There's something that comes together. And again, it reminds me, going back to Eretz Yisrael today, to Israel today, that Rav Soloveitchik wrote an essay called Odi Dofek. And in the essay, he differentiated between a covenant of fate and a covenant of destiny. And when he speaks about the notion, he says that a covenant of fate we had during the Holocaust, after the Holocaust, right? We couldn't run away from being Jews. Hitler wanted to kill us. We couldn't hide the fact that we were Jew. That's a covenant of fate. We had no choice. We were fated together. And in a sense, maybe even after the Holocaust, when we choose to continue as a people, we're completing what he calls the covenant of fate. But he asks the question, he says, what about the covenant of destiny? What is the covenant? Yes, it's true. Fate forces us together. Okay, when we're attacked, when we're under attack, we're very good at being together. But what happens when we're not under attack? What happens when we're trying to create a society, when we're trying to build a society? And Rav Soloveitchik there says, that's what he calls the covenant of destiny. What is our ye'ud? What is our purpose? What is our goal? And at that stage, it's much more difficult to create a unity. It's much more difficult to create something that we all align with in some way or another. And that really, I would say, perhaps, Rav Soloveitchik's definition of a covenant of destiny has been the central the central idea that's actually pulled us apart, because it's very, very difficult to find something in the middle. And the Or HaChaim is saying here that Torah, when we learn Torah, that's what brings us, that's what pulls us together. Okay, if I think about Rav Benny Lau's 929, to me that's the beginning of a covenant of destiny, halavai, that it would connect everybody, right? And again here, I brought for you a book called Reasoning and Revelation, which is a book on postmodern reading of the Torah. And it has most of, I would say, the most well-known postmodern thinkers in Judaism today. Okay, Stephen Kepnes, Peter Ox, Gibbs, Judith Kornberg, Greenberg, all of these people are what they define themselves certainly as postmodern thinkers. And in that book, they discuss, it's a very philosophical book, but if those of you that are interested, I highly recommend it. It's an amazing, amazing book. And in that book, there's a dialogue. It's written, most of it is written as a dialogue. And they discuss the idea of textual, it's called textual, reasoning after revelation, textual, the subtitle is textual reasoning in a postmodern age or something like that. And in that book, they basically speak about how in a postmodern time, do we read the Torah? Okay, it's fascinating. But one of the things that they really hone in on, one of the things that they really kind of emphasize is the idea of reading as a community. Now, anyone who knows anything about postmodernism, you'll know that the postmodern kind of philosophy is very much about the subjective being. Okay, it's much less about objective facts, abstract ideas, ideals. Okay, it's much more about how does the subjective person make meaning in their lives, and every person or every community will create a different meaning for that community. And there's not necessarily one truth with a capital T, but there's many truths with small t's. And they talk about the idea of the Torah being a community of readers, that over the centuries, how the Torah has developed is through communal reading. And again, to me, this is so important. And I want to just share with you what they say, and we'll connect it to what we've been saying. I agree with the vision and objective of creating a human partnership around a text. I would emphasize that the central issue for us is that of agency. In other words, what texts we study is secondary to the question of how we study them. Okay? Our premise and inspiration is the creation of a community based on the shared reading, it should say, I think, of text. The existential return to the Jewish text is inspired by Franz Rosenzweig, whose return to her full Jewish life was grounded in the study of classical text. And by the way, all of those thinkers, Rosenzweig, Levinas, Buber, all of those, and they're called, by the way, dialogical thinkers. That's what their term is. Dialogical thinkers, because when they read the Torah text, they read it as a dialogical process. They read it not just as a process of someone reading on their own, but as a process of interconnecting with other people around them. Following Rosenzweig's basic theory of speech thinking, a characteristic of postmodern Jewish philosophy is dialogue as the medium for doing philosophy. The vision here is of dialogical relationships created in a community of philosophers who gather together to study traditional Jewish texts. In contrast, it should say, not contract, in contrast with Hegelian dialectical reading, which severs the sense of continuity between historical periods, we wish to read previous texts with humility and careful listening. Okay, and again, this goes back to what we said about the Midbar. In the Midbar, two of the things that are two of the my head is gone this morning. Two of the consequences of being in the midbar, being in the wilderness, is number one, that our sense of sound, our sense of listening is much, much more acute. And the second, okay, is the idea of humility. And this is exactly when you're reading in a community, you have to have a sense of humility and you have to listen. If you don't listen carefully, and again, this we said at the beginning of the class that today is Yitzhak Rabin's Yahrzeit, and I think that again is perhaps one of the remedies to our community today, is that no one really listens. There's no true listening. Much more important is what I say as opposed to listening to what the other person says. Okay? And by the way, it needs two people to listen. Because if only one person is listening, it doesn't help. Okay? We criticize as oppressive the modernist tendency to generalize a particular tradition. Rather, we aim to create a dialogical relationship that emphasizes polysemic readings and continuity between historical periods and texts. So again, we have two things going on here. Okay, many readings. We have two things going on here. One is the movement between historical periods, meaning when we read a text, do not read it as a standalone thing. It has to be read with something that came before and something that came after, with the interpretations that came before and the interpretations that come after. We are part of a much bigger tradition than just ourselves. But I think even more than this, so here I'm going to take it specifically to what we're doing this year. When we read a text in Tanakh, it's very easy to take it out of its context. Okay, and that, unfortunately, when I grew up in the school that I went to, we used to learn text totally out of context. They would simply place a text in front of us, and they wouldn't give us any context to it. And I remember so clearly when I sat for the first time in Rav Menachem Liebtag's shiur when I was in Orot on my year off, and he taught us Brit Ben HaBatarim. And I remember I had learned it in school, and I had learned it out of context totally, just with the pasuk and comma and few Rashi and Rambam, whatever. And I remember never really truly understanding what the teacher was going on about, the cutting of the covenant and the parts and the animals and I had no idea, literally no idea. And I sat in Rav Menachem Liebtag's class, and he had obviously contextualized it within the idea of Brit and what Brit is and Abraham and and a million different things. And all of a sudden I came out, I felt like I had been enlightened. I remember I called my mum that evening. I was like, I don't understand. What have I been doing for the last 15 years in Jewish education? I don't understand. Something had, just from understanding a text within a context. And that's what they're saying here. But that also humbles you. When you understand, number one, it allows enlightenment. You see something different when you're seeing something within a context of the actual text itself. But also when you're learning something with a tradition, all these books that come behind you, right, that, in which their shoulders you're standing, it humbles you. I'm just a small part in this huge, massive thing. So there's humility, and there's listening, and there's community, and there's relationship, and there's vulnerability, and there's all of these things when we're coming to learning a text. And David Patterson, this is a book I happenstance on when I was doing research for my doctorate, a very, very interesting book. It's called Open Wounds, The Crisis of Jewish Thought, source number 15, The Crisis of Jewish Thought in the Aftermath of the Holocaust. And here he talks about a beautiful idea. I'm just going to jump straight in. The distinction between the two, viewed in Hebrew terms, is clear. To explain, he talks about the difference to explain and to understand, okay? Is literally to bring into be'or, right? Lahavhil, right? Yet part of what I think you should say, yet part of what characterizes the open wounds of Jewish thought is the shadow of Auschwitz that extends over all thinking, despite the Torah or the light of the Torah. Okay, so he's talking about the idea of how can we learn in a post-Holocaust world. What does Auschwitz, what does the Holocaust do to our learning? What does it do to our interconnection, to our community, to the tradition, to the way we examine, explain, and interpret the Torah? Okay, by the way, the book before, Reasoning and Revelation, also speaks a lot about learning Torah in the light of the Holocaust. But here he comes, this is what I wanted to bring you. The Hebrew word for understanding is binah, which is a matter not of clarifying a concept, but of establishing a relation between God and human, between human and human. For the Hebrew verb to understand is lahavin. Its root is ben, which means between. I think this is just, I read that, I was never even thought about it, and I thought, whoa, that is the difference between the Greek way of learning and the Jewish way of learning. The Greek way of learning is to dissect something and to put it into a box. Okay, to understand, to explain is to find an answer that boxes something, puts it away, it remains there, and it doesn't get touched again. Okay, the Jewish way of understanding is lahavin, to understand. But what does it mean when it's ben leven? So to me it means two things. Number one, it means relationship. And a relationship is not static. A relationship is organic, it grows, it's dynamic, it's constantly changing. Okay? That's why in Judaism, your understanding should never be static. We should constantly be changing, growing, learning, etc. But I think even more than that, when we talk about the idea of ben leven, between, that also is not just the idea of relationship, right? But the idea that perhaps not everything can be categorized and idealized and put into a box. Sometimes it remains in that ephemeral space, right? That space of ben leven, okay? And I think that's super important, because when we go back to Aviva Zornberg and she speaks about reading in the silences, reading between the words, right? That's that space. That's that space that she speaks about. I'm going to carry on, and then I'll take comments because I can see. Just let me finish to the end. Clarifying a concept, but of establishing a relationship between God and human. Okay, we did that, sorry. Whereas explanation pertains to what is clear, distinct by their natural light. In the Shoah, we confront an unnatural darkness so that we must reject explanation for the sake of entering into a relation of understanding. As the 15th century Don Isaac Abarbanel pointed out, understanding requires a human dialogical relation. It requires a between space. The movement towards the other human being required of understanding is what makes understanding an essential feature of tshuva, the movement to return to Torah, as our sages have taught. I don't want to get into that too much, but what he says is that the Shoah brought this darkness whereby this way of understanding as natural light, as clear, as clarity, has been darkened. And now our understanding has to only be through the notion of binah.
But that's your idea. Ben leven is ben mashaya leven mashiyeh. So when nothing stays by itself, you have to look at where we came from and where we're going.
100%.
So that's exactly what you were talking about.
Okay, so I'm just going to repeat it for those on Zoom. So the idea of ben leven, of what was and what will be, right? And that in between, 100%, I think that's exactly the idea of what we said about tradition. Okay. Okay, is there any other questions until now? Questions, comments, everything clear? Okay, so now David Wolpe, who again is a very interesting contemporary rabbi, conservative rabbi, who he writes a lot in the Jerusalem Post as well. That's why his name might be familiar with some of you. He has a book called Why Faith Matters, and in that book he goes through a journey, his own journey. He had cancer and what he went through, and also being at the same time a pulpit rabbi and what that meant. And his journey, he left the fold for many years, like in his teenagehood and afterwards, and then he returns, and why he returns, and what it means to him. And it's a beautiful book. It's very, very nice, kind of simple reading, but very profound, and some beautiful ideas. And here again, he goes back to the idea of the Bible, and what does the Bible mean? And he says like this: the Bible is not written for one era or generation. So again, this notion that it's over time, it unfolds, right? It's survived because it speaks anew to each receptive spirit in each successive age. When I first learned the stories of the Bible, they were interesting, at times charming. With age, they deepen into comfort, inspiration, and provocation. In the years since that time, I have found in the Bible an ever-renewable resource for meaning and guidance. Biblical sufferers touch us through their shared pain. In our fractured and difficult lives, reading a chronicle of difficulty and failure can be encouraging and even healing. The heroes of the Bible are not perfect. Their marriages are not storybooks. Their relations with their children not frictionless. All of us who struggle with real problems of families, of work, can look to the Bible not as one has looked to a fairy tale, but with the recognition that everything has changed since the time of Sarah and Abraham, except Abraham and Sarah, except human nature. And the reason why I brought this here is because exactly it talks about the idea of the relationship, the idea of Ben Leven, also touching on the notion of vulnerability. Now, when I think about the Yosef stories, by the way, the Yosef story is basically probably the longest narrative about any one individual in the Tanakh, okay? Or certainly in the Torah. Maybe not in the Tanakh, because you've got David and Shlom, perhaps. I don't know. I'd have to check out how many prakim is each one, right? But definitely in the Torah. You know almost everything about his life. You know things about him that very often we're not told also in other places. And I always ask myself, why? Why do we have to know so much about Yosef? But to me, it's not just about Yosef. To me, the Yosef stories reflect exactly what David Wolpe is talking about here. They reflect the fact that also, certainly the whole of Sefer Bereshit, everything we've been doing over the last 5 years, right, not including 3 years, 4 years, this is our 4th year, not including last year, right, last year we didn't do it, but everything that we've been looking at is about basically defunct families, right? We looked at Abraham and Sarah. We looked at what happened when they went down to Egypt, how Abraham gave Sarah to the pharaohs, how we looked at how he gives Hagar, and then he chucks Hagar and Ishmael into the desert, and then what Abraham feels, and the Akedah, and then we spoke about Yitzchak, who in himself is totally post-PTSD in every sense possible, and what Yaakov does, and how Yaakov's family are suffering on the heels of everything that happens with Yitzchak. And then we have Yosef, and we like to think that maybe there'll be a happy ending. And in a sense, there is a happy ending, because at the end we see that somehow, Yosef sees, to an extent, he manages to bring together the brothers. But until we get to that point, how much damage is done along the way? How many things, how many traumas, how many crises, how many unbridged gaps between family members have unfolded? And to me, this is exactly, when we're talking about Ben Leven, we're talking about understanding, we're talking about relationship, we're talking about Torah learning in Chavruta, there is also exactly this idea that, and I want us to be totally clear, relationships, both that we see in Tanakh, in Torah, and that we have in Chavruta, and that we have in our real lives, are messy. They are messy. And anyone who doesn't have a messy relationship either is very, very lucky, or I would say isn't really making themselves particularly meaning, is that relationship, is there vulnerability in that relationship? That's what I'll ask, right? I think there is messiness in every family, right? I'm sure if we went around the room, we're not going to do it, but I'm sure if we went around the room and we asked people, everyone would, if everyone was very open, we would find that every single person sitting here has some kind of messiness in their family, somewhere, right? And that's real. And that's what the Torah is. The Torah is real. It's not blinding us to the fact that relationships are messy. And when we're talking about learning, we're also not blinded to the fact that the Torah is messy, that learning the Torah can be messy, that there's things that don't sit comfortably. But if we don't open ourselves up, then we won't get anywhere. And here I want to share with you one of the very beautiful stories in the Talmud, beautiful and tragic stories in the Talmud about a messy Chavruta. Okay? And I'm going to read it to you from beginning to the end, and we're going to try and understand why I've brought it here, because I think it is exactly touches on this idea of vulnerability, of Chavruta, of relationship, and of the danger of what a relationship is. Okay? One day, Rabbi Yochanan was swimming in the Jordan. Reish Lakish saw him and leapt into the Jordan after him, Jordan River, right? Rabbi Yochanan said, "Your strength for Torah," and Reish Lakish says, "Your beauty for women." Rabbi Yochanan said to him, "If you return, I will give you my sister who is more beautiful than me." Reish Lakish accepted. Reish Lakish tried to go back and collect his weapons, but he was not able to go back, meaning his strength weakened, right? Rabbi Yochanan taught him scripture and oral Torah and made him a great man. One day they diverged in the Bet Midrash. The sword and the knife and the military spear and the hand sickle and the harvesting sickle, from where do they acquire tum'ah? From where do they acquire ritual impurity? From the time when their production is complete. And when there is a production complete, Rabbi Yochanan said, from when they're tempered in the furnace. Okay, so we're asking, when is something mekabel tum'ah, right? When is a sharp object or a metal object, when is it mekabel tum'ah? And Rabbi Yochanan begins and he says, when it's being fired, right? Reish Lakish says, when it's polished with water. Rabbi Yochanan turns to Reish Lakish and says, a thief knows about the tools of thievery. Okay? Now again, it's not by chance that the imagery here is a knife. Okay? The Gemaras know it uses a lot of imagery in order to give us over a certain message. The imagery here is of a knife, and this is exactly what Reish Lakish feels. He feels as though Rabbi Yochanan has stabbed a knife into him. Why? Because it's maybe even the way he says it. You would know, right? You're wrong. You don't agree with me. And I'm telling you why you don't agree with me, because you were a thief, okay? And Reish Lakish said to him, and how have you benefited me? There they call me master, and here they call me master. He says, what did I gain by becoming a Torah scholar? Right? What did I gain? Meaning he turns around to him and says, you made me come into this life. Well, nothing's really changed. Okay? Meaning the minute I use derogative language, or the minute I belittle someone, or the minute I use someone's vulnerability to harm them, they will immediately become defensive. We have to remember that. If I am vulnerable in front of somebody and they try to harm me through my vulnerability, the very first thing I will do is put up a fence. That's the very first thing I'm going to do. Okay? And that's exactly what happens here. Rabbi Yochanan said to him, Reish Lakish, I've benefited you by bringing you under the wings of the Shekhinah. So Rabbi Yochanan tries to go back on himself. He tries to fix. He says, but look, I brought you under the wings of the Shekhinah. Rabbi Yochanan became very upset, and Reish Lakish became weak. His sister came and cried, and she said to Rabbi Yochanan, pray for the healing for the sake of my sons, right? She says to him, please, okay, his children, he's going to die. He said to her, leave your orphans, I will sustain them. What does Rabbi Yochanan do? He says, I'm not going to pray for him. He's so angry, right? Do it for the sake of my widow, he said to her, and put your widow's trust in me. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish died, and Rabbi Yochanan grieved over him greatly. And again, here I want to show, and it's funny, it's not maybe, although not by chance, that this is Dafka the day of Rabin's death. Because even though there's the knives that are being, and even though someone's angry, and when you're angry, you put up fences, and you say things that are bitter, and you say, but ultimately, when someone dies, when something like that happens, the wounds, the grief is so great that even the people that wanted maybe to harm that person, that wanted to put that knife in, all of a sudden take a step back. And how does one fix that? And the answer is, in this tragic story, there's no easy fix. There's no easy fix. The rabbi said, who shall we send to ease his mind? Let us send Rabbi Eliezer ben Padat, whose ideas are very, very sharp. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan's gone into a type of depression. He realizes, or he recognizes, that he is guilty to a degree for the death of Reish Lakish, of his dear Chavruta, over the years, the person who he returned to Judaism, who married his sister, or who married his sister to, etc., etc. So they bring in this Rabbi Elazar, and he sat before him, before Rabbi Yochanan. Every statement that Rabbi Yochanan would say, he would say to him, there's a brighter that supports you. He said, are you like Bar Lakisha? Bar Lakisha, when I would say a thing, he challenged me with 24 objections. And I would answer him with 24 answers, which led to a fuller understanding of the law. And you say, there's a writer that supports you, right? Do I not already know that I've spoken well? He went out and tore his clothes, and he cried, and he said, where are you, Bar Lakisha? Where are you? And he shouted until his mind left him. The rabbis asked for mercy for him, and he died. Okay? This is such a tragic, tragic story, but there's underlying the theological, or I would even say actually not even theological, the psychological underpinnings of this are super important. Okay, there's a few things here that I think really speak to us. Number one, the idea that exactly what we're speaking about, this idea of monopolization of the truth, and this idea of when we go to extremes, right? That at the end of the day, Rabbi Yochanan says, why did you bring someone to have a chavruta with me that is just going to agree with me? That's not the point of a chavruta. The point of the chavruta is to have the ben leben, is to have that disagreement. But there are also dangers in a chavruta. And the danger is that when one has those arguments, those disagreements, when one knows that one's being challenged, when one has a true chavruta, and that truly you're putting everything into it, one has to still be extremely careful with their words. One still has to be extremely careful with maintaining a relationship that on the one hand, it's a very, very thin line, that on the one hand allows for vulnerability, and on the other hand, allows for disagreement. Okay? And ultimately what we see in this Talmud is that when that doesn't happen, and when someone is hurt, it's almost impossible to fix that situation. Okay? The beauty of the Yosef story, and to me this is why Yosef is Yosef HaSadiq, is because Yosef manages somehow, and we'll discuss why and how Yosef does it, because he himself goes through an incredible growth, right? How does Yosef manage in the end to allow for healing amongst the brothers? Now we're going to question if there's absolute healing, because I'm not 100% sure that there's absolute healing, but there's definitely healing of a kind. And Yosef is the one that orchestrates that healing. And how does he do it? And in my mind, again, going back to this Gemara here, Yosef does that by, number one, by allowing the brothers themselves to see themselves differently. Okay, not to see themselves in a good light rather than a bad light. And this is exactly the opposite of what happens with Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. What Rabbi Yochanan does to Reish Lakish is to remind him of the bad light in a bad way. And then the barrier goes up. And then there's aggression, right? Yosef's story is the opposite. Okay, the Yosef story allows them to go through a cathartic process whereby they are able finally to see what they have done and what they did in a different light. And we're going to even ask the question as we go through it, and this we're going to see hopefully in the next few weeks. Did the brothers really actually sell Yosef? That's a whole nother question into itself, right? I'm not sure they did, but then the question is, what did they do wrong? Okay, and therefore, what are they holding? What are they holding in themselves? In source number 18, we have the Mishnah Navot that again speaks to us about all the various ways in which Torah learning is great, right? Dola Torah yater min hakuna or min hamalchut. Okay, that Torah learning is greater than the priesthood and greater than royalty. שהמלכות נקנית ב-30 מעלות והכהונה ב-24 והתורה נקנית ב-48 דברים. Right, the Torah is acquired through 48 ways. Okay, and they go through all the different ways, but I bolded the ones that are particularly important for us. Okay, the 48 ways that are particularly important for us are attentive listening, okay, proper speech, understanding of heart, intelligent heart, awe, by the way, awe and fear, okay, which is in Hebrew, one second, where is it in Hebrew? B'yir'ah u'ba'anava. Look at be'ema, b'yir'ah u'ba'anava. Yir'ah and anava come next to each other, and that is exactly what we've been speaking about. That anava, that humility allows me to live or to approach the Torah with awe, right? That this awe, that the ability to see that there's something above me, there's not just I, there's the we, there's more than just me, there's the tradition that comes before me, the tradition that comes after me. Okay, by critical give and take with a friend, by fine argumentation with disciples, okay, further along, who asks and answers, who listens to others, adds knowledge, who learns in order to teach, who learns in order to practice, who makes his teacher wiser, who is exacting what he has learned, and who says a thing in the name of who said it. Okay, which again, by the way, is very interesting. Okay, ha'omer davar b'shem omro is so super important. Okay, and why is that so super important? Because that is the basis again of humility, right? If I say, oh, I've got this amazing idea, okay, and I say this idea and I speak it out loud, right? But I don't say who the idea comes from. What I'm doing is I'm essentially saying I'm amazing, and it's me rather than the idea that's the most important thing. It's about me, it's not about the Torah learning, okay? As someone who unfortunately, and I was plagiarized at one point, and someone once said to me that they'd been plagiarized, like, oh, it's not such a big deal. Okay, so someone copied something you wrote, new. But when it happens to you and you realize that it deeply, deeply hurts you, because it almost feels like someone's abused, someone's taken something from you, because it comes, and again, it made me realize, I think for me, what it really touched me really, it made me realize that it wasn't even about me. I said at the time, I was like, should I do something, should I not do something? And I realized that it was more about the idea that it made me realize that when something comes from deep, deep within, that if you feel like you have to get it out there. And again, all my stuff is all online. I'm not keeping anything to myself, right? I teach, it goes out, it's recorded, anyone. But it really, there's this kind of, this recognition, I think, more than anything, that part of Torah learning, part of sharing Torah is that when you uncover, and again, I don't believe that everything that people say is new. Probably it was written, who knows, maybe years ago, maybe by someone else in a different way, whatever it is. But when it comes from that deep place and you bring it out, and then it's taken or it's used by somebody else to elevate their name, then you realize that there's a place in which you've been hurt. Now again, I asked myself a million times, was it your ego that was hurt, or was it the Torah that was, what exactly? I went through this whole process. But here, it really, really made me think, when you read this, Haomer Devar B'Shem Omro, why is that so important? And the Torah is saying it's important not so much for the person who said it, but for the person who's saying it. For the person who's saying it in the sense that they should recognize always to step down with a sense of humility, okay? To learn Torah with a sense of humility. Okay, so that's the end of our intro to Torah learning and to the process that we're going to go through, okay? To the way in which I'm hoping that this class will bring all the various things. I want to finish with two more sources, both of which talk a little bit about the idea of Genesis in particular, Bereshit in particular, of the Yosef story in particular, and then I'm going to talk about methodology and how we're going to go about it and what we're going to cover. So, what's new? Okay, so Robert Alter, who's a very well-known biblical scholar, writes as follows. Genesis is the only one of the 5 books, source number 19. Genesis is the only one of the 5 books that is more or less continuous narrative from beginning to the end. The only recurrent but limited exception being the genealogies, which, as I shall try to indicate in the commentary, have a function as structural and thematic markers. Nowhere else in ancient literature have the quirkiness and unpredictability of individual character and the frictions and tensions of family life, sibling rivalry, the jealousy of co-wives, the extravagance of parental favoritism, been registered with such subtlety and insight. Now, I find it particularly amazing. I'm going to stop here for 1 second. If we think back to most ancient writings, writing at the same time as Torah, number one, all they're basically law, but mostly law. Okay, so you've got various laws that are found in the Hammurabi codes and various things like that, or they are mythologies. And when we look at mythologies, they are all about the gods, right? Or they're about jealousy between the gods. But there's in fact, almost no ancient literature that's written about the messiness of humanity, right? What does it mean to live as human beings? Now, what I find mind-blowing, absolutely mind-blowing, every single time I go back to Sefer Bereshit, is that we're reading here an ancient text, okay? Ultimately, okay? If we're looking at it, forget for the minute, just for a second, take yourself out of looking at it as a revelatory text. If we're looking at it purely, right, as a text that was written thousands and thousands of years ago by an author, right, it shouldn't have any bearing on us today. It shouldn't. But to me, that's why it is a revelatory text, because it speaks to me in the 21st century about my psychological dilemmas, right, about my ethical dilemmas, about my moral musings, in a way that I don't think any other ancient text could speak to me, okay? An ancient text may tell me something about the law that they kept in those times, and perhaps we can contrast it with what we do today. But the book of Bereshit, there's something there that is perennial about the human condition and edifying for us today. And to me, that just smacks of something transcendent. to me personally, right? I can't, there's no other way for me to understand it but for it to be a text that is written specifically to be interpreted over the generations and to speak to every generation differently. And that is my aim of this class. My aim of this class is not just to read it as an ancient text and just to read it in a literary way. In fact, we're not going to be engaging in massive literary analysis, okay? I leave that to other teachers. It's not my particular speciality. We're going to be reading it in a very philosophical, very theological, very edifying manner. And what do I mean by that? I mean we are going to be unpacking various themes that come out and trying to understand this. I'm going to get in a second to exactly what we're going to be doing. I'm going to continue. What nevertheless strongly binds the two large units of the book of Genesis is both outlook and theme. The unfolding history of the family that is to become the people of Israel is seen, as I've suggested, as the crucial focus of a larger universal history. The very peregrinations of the family back and forth between Mesopotamia and Canaan and down to Egypt intimate that its scope involved not just the land Israel had been promised, but the wider reach of known cultures. National existence, moreover, is emphatically imagined as a strenuous effort to renew the act of creation. Okay, there's a parallel between the first two chapters of Bereshit and the rest of Bereshit. Genesis begins with the making of the heaven, earth, and all life, and ends with the image of a mummy, Joseph's, in a coffin. But what is implicit in the end is a promise of more life to come, of irrepressible procreation, and that renewal of creation will be manifested even under the weight of oppression at the beginning of the Exodus. Okay, so again, what we're seeing is that the book of Bereshit is, whereas the creation story is the divine, transcendent creation story of the world, the book of Bereshit is the creation story of mankind. That ultimately ends with the beginning of a nation. So the Bereshit is the individual. If the focus is on the prototypical individual human being and the development of that human being in relationship, Shemot is the prototypical development of the nation, okay, and Bamidbar as well, right? And Bereshit, obviously the first few chapters of Bereshit are to do with the creation of the world, which we know very little about. Ultimately, it's very enigmatic, and it's enigmatic for a reason, because it's not really our concern. Our concern is not to be physicists. Our concern is to be, obviously, physicists we need in the world, but I'm saying not to know how God created the world. Our concern is to know how to create our world, right? How to rectify relationships, human relationships, how to build nations, how to build communities, how to build societies, how to build families. Okay, so I finished with Leon Cass. Leon Cass, I'm going to be using a lot. I've used him in the past a lot. He has a beautiful book called The Beginning of Wisdom, very, very, very large book, almost too large because you can hardly carry it around. He is, talking about a physicist, he is an American physicist, scientist, a public intellectual now, much more than he was. He for many, many years, he was very involved in, he was a bioethicist, basically, okay? He was involved in ethical problems of biology and various other things, of science, etc. And then at some point, he tells the story that he came to Israel for a conference, and he met with, I can't remember, he quotes him all the time, I can't remember what his name is. He met with a biblical scholar, and they started having a conversation, and he said suddenly the penny dropped that he didn't know anything or knew very little about his heritage. And from that moment on, he went, and as he's very intellectual, very, very kind of channeled, he spent years basically studying the Bible from the beginning. Okay, and this is someone who really was not brought up with any Jewish education. He begins with the absolute basic, the biblical text. He then goes on to classic commentaries, Rashi, Rambam, Nechama Leibovitz. He then goes on to modern scholarship, Aviva Zornberg he brings in sometimes, okay, all very... And what comes out, and then he basically said, decided I was going to give a course in university, not for grades, like a non-grade course, I don't know how you call that. And he said it just grew and it grew and it grew. And ultimately he wrote this book. In my mind, I think it's one of the most incredible contemporary commentaries on the Bible in my mind. It's set on Genesis, on Bereshit. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. and I'm going to use it a lot. But this just here, he talks about specifically about the Joseph stories. And he says like this: the last section of the book of Genesis, chapters 37 to 50, is often read as if it were a small novella entitled Joseph and His Brothers. It is, to be sure, an affecting family story, a tale of malice and mastery, of malice and mastery, of near fratricide and forgiveness, featuring one of the Bible's most talented and charismatic figures, Joseph, the favorite son of Jacob. Yet if it is read only in this way, abstracted from the larger context of the emerging nation of Israel, the special significance of the story for the book of Genesis will escape the reader, for it deals with crucial questions of perpetuation and preservation at a critical junction for the nascent people of the covenant. Any new political group, no matter how well founded, faces the challenge of perpetuation, which is always endangered by threats of disintegration within and assimilation without. Okay, so again, what he's doing is he's contextualizing the Joseph stories. Yeah, I'm going to contextualize them differently to the way he does. When we look at it, we're going to contextualize it in the sense of the covenant. And what does it mean to be following the covenant? And why does this story happen specifically with this covenantal framework in mind? Here, he's doing something different. He's looking at it more sociologically. And he's saying when we create a nation, okay, two of the things that are going to be at the heart of our worries, or two dangers that face creating a nation, are the idea of how do I perpetuate the nation? How do I allow it to continue? And how do I stop us being assimilated? Okay? And he said that these are the two, he believes that these are the two currents that run through the story of Joseph. Internally, ways must be found to overcome division and to promote unity and peace. And the danger of fratricide must yield at least to concord, if not to full brotherhood. Externally, ways must be found to prevent absorption into neighboring polities and cultures, both willingly by assimilation or unwillingly by conquest. Perpetuation thus requires leadership that can promote internal cohesion and preserve attachment to the way of the fathers in the face not only of hostile enemies bent on your destruction or subjection, but also, especially also, of welcoming neighbors whose blandishments and bounties make you forget who you are. Leadership within and assimilation versus separation without are the two big themes the text explores in the saga of Joseph and his brothers. And I want to just say a point here. I'm not going to repeat that. It was clear, right? Assimilation from out, integration from within. And Joseph is very much the prototypical person that does both these things. He prevents assimilation from out. We see when he goes to Egypt and he remembers his tradition, his parents, his family, and he allows ultimately for unity within. So Joseph really represents the ultimate way, the ultimate method of maintaining both of these elements. But I want to just point out something here as well, which when I read this, it really made me think very, very strong about this idea. We've spoken all the time about the idea of the vulnerability of the text, the idea of being in an uncomfortable place, the idea of holding on tradition, what comes before, what comes after, of continuing along the journey. And I've said to you many, many times that the Torah isn't perfect. I don't mean that in a anachronistic way. I'm not saying it's not perfect because it's divinely given, but it's not perfect because it deals with human beings. And human beings are messy, and the world is messy, and the way in which we live is messy, and therefore the Torah itself is going to be messy to a degree, okay? And therefore there's going to be things there that are going to make us uncomfortable. And one of the things that make people very, very uncomfortable is that when the people of Israel go into the land of Israel, do they have to slaughter all the nations and not leave any nation? And in Sefer Yoshua we have all those, the ethics of war, and how can we deal with that with our modern conscience, etc., etc. And here, when I read this, I realize one of the big dilemmas, right, that God had, or Moshe had, or Yoshua had, and that is how to create a nation. We're not talking here, again, when I was reading recently, can you still see me when I move? Gosh, I don't like not being able to move. I was reading recently the autobiography of Amos Oz, and I don't know how I've not read it till now, okay? It's incredible. And he talks there very much about the early days. He lived in Yerushalayim before the state became a state, and then when the state became a state, and then the War of Independence. And again, Amos Oz, who we know is very left-wing, not quite, very left-wing. But when you read the book, you wouldn't even necessarily think, because he really describes there in a profound way what they face. They face destruction. When the leaders came to declare the state of Israel, they knew that by declaring the state of Israel, there was a very high chance that everybody there would be obliterated. And yet they took that risk, right? And one of the things he talks about is this idea that we had no choice. We had to do what we had to do. And when we look back to Sefer Yoshua, we say they had to come to the land, they had to destroy everyone in the land. And again, this goes back exactly to what Leon Cass is saying here. There are dilemmas that are put before us where sometimes we have to put creating the nation and the perpetuation of the nation and the risk of assimilation ahead of other ethical. Does that mean that going and killing people, coming into land and killing people is right? No, it absolutely does not, right? But it's messy. It's very messy. It's not clear-cut. There's no clear edges. And ultimately, by immersing ourselves into Judaism, into our tradition, into a Jewish text, into the Torah, into Tanakh, into everything that comes afterwards, into the rabbinic mind, we are immersing ourselves into messiness, okay? Into places that are uncomfortable. And with that comes an incredible richness in our lives. The sense of humility that we come before and after something. The sense that maybe there are things we just don't know, and there's decisions that have to be made, and they've been made with people before us, far greater than us, in much more difficult circumstances. And we have to bend and bow and I finish with the Ramban that we began with, that he says, I prostrate myself and every single element of my spine is bent over before you, Hashem, and yet I'm bringing a chidush, right? And that oscillation between majesty and humility, between submission and dignity, right, should always be at the back of our minds in everything that we're learning and in every sugya that we're coming towards. And we're going to read things in the Torah and we're going to ask ourselves the question in the Yosef story. We are named Bnei Yisrael, and we read about Yehuda and Tamar, and we read about Reuven and Bilhah, and we read about the brothers putting Yosef in a pit and potentially selling him, and we read about all these, and the rape of Dinah and everything else that came up, and we say, we tell ourselves we're Bnei Yisrael, we're the ancestors of these people. And again, I want to remind us, okay, living is messy. And therefore, everything that we read, we are going to say, we're going to look, we're going to ask, we can be, with modern minds, be critical, but at the same time, we're going to take a step back and say, we don't know everything. We're nodding, giving a nod to our humility. And I think that is one of the key ideas that the majesty and humility, the up and the down, is going to follow us throughout the whole story of Yosef, throughout our learning, and throughout everything else that we're doing. I'm going to finish here, and I'm going to, 1 second, then I'm going to open up for, I don't know, there's so many people on Zoom, so I'm going to open up to Zoom, and I'm going to open up to you. One thing I want to say is in terms of methodology. So as I already said, what we're going to be doing is the way we did it the last few years. We're going to be taking a narrative. Okay, so for example, the first narrative is going to be obviously this narrative of Yosef and his brothers. We're going to be reading the narrative, and then we are going to be unpacking different themes in the narrative. We are going to obviously be looking at the text. We're going to be trying to understand what happens in the story, and then we're going to be unpacking. So for example, when we look at the story of Yosef, we're going to begin with the idea of Yeshev Yaakov, and what does it mean to settle, and why shouldn't, looking at the Rashi, why shouldn't Yaakov have settled? Okay, and the idea, and we're going to unpack that idea. We're then going to unpack, for example, the other idea, which is the idea of the stranger on the way. What does that mean? Okay, the stranger that Yosef meets on the way. And dreams, okay? What are Yosef's dreams? What is dreaming? What is the notion of dreaming? And why is that important for us in the story of Yosef? There's going to be lots and lots and lots of different things we're going to be looking at. But what I'm saying is it's going to be based on those of you that have been in my classes will know, but I'm talking more for people that haven't. It's going to be based on a more theological, philosophical unpacking of the narrative rather than a strict literary analysis. Obviously, a literary analysis is going to come into it because we can't unpack it theologically if we don't understand it. But it's not going to be solely based on that. Okay, so that's in terms of methodology. Questions from here, and then I'm going to open up questions from. I'm going to do like this. Okay. Okay, I think you can undo your cat. Has anyone got any questions? You can't see me, but I'm looking at you. The camera's there. Yeah, I know the camera's there. Anyone on Zoom, you can open up and you can ask. I think everyone can hear you. Anyone here, any questions? Comments? Questions? Clear? Fabulous. Any questions on Zoom? All good? Thumbs up? Excellent. Okay, Tov, so thank you all. Again, a reminder, on Thursday, there is a text study group. There are literally maybe 1 or 2 places left for people that want to come. It's from 9 to 10:30. If you do, come and speak to me afterwards. Otherwise, I'll see all of you on next week. Those of you that want to be added to the WhatsApp group, I'm going to send already on the WhatsApp group the source sheet through the Safaria link. So if you want to get the source sheet, just make sure that you're added to the WhatsApp group.
Are you familiar with Jonathan Haidt's book?
Yes.
Huh?
I know, I just read it, The Conding of the American Mind.
No.
Which one?
How
Oh, okay. Okay, everybody, hi. Just a reminder, if you haven't signed up and you want to, these were 2 trial classes. If you haven't signed up and you want to sign up to the class, make sure to sign up and then I'll add you to the WhatsApp. And by the way, there's a Rabbi Sachs evening on Sunday night on Zoom. It's free, but you need to sign up to get the Zoom link.
it's